Hey now. So we've got a few phyla left in lab, and so I wanted to briefly cover one of those phyla today, the Echinodermata. Not too much to talk about with this group. So up to this point, since the sponges, we've talked about a lot of different phyla, and they've all been protostomes, right? The mouth is formed first. But now we are jumping to our last group of phyla, which are the deuterostomes. And you remember the deuterostomes have a few things different. The main thing is that the anus is formed first and the mouth is formed later. So it's a completely different mode of development. The two main phyla that we're going to talk about in the deuterostomes are the Echinodermata, and then later on I'll talk to you about the Chordata. There are a few other small phyla that we're not going to have time to get to. And so let's talk about Phylum Echinodermata a little bit. I don't have much to say about these things. We don't have them in Kentucky. These are things like starfish, brittle stars, sea urchins, sea cucumbers, sea lilies, all marine animals. And you're familiar with starfish. Maybe you've seen sea urchins or sea cucumbers before. And it seems really unlikely, or it seems really weird that we think that those organisms are closely related to chordates, to us, right? Except, specifically, if you look at starfish, they have radial symmetry. And we haven't seen radial symmetry since, some of those earlier groups and those more sedentary groups. But when you study them, then you start to see these things that suggest, oh, these groups actually are more closely related to us. For example, starfish larvae have bilateral symmetry, even though the adults don't. And so again, when you look at their development, and so if you look at the development, they are deuterostomes. The anus forms first, just like in the chordates. And so you start to look at these things in more detail, and you realize the echinoderms are closely related to the chordates. Again, there are only marine forms in Echinodermata. They don't osmoregulate, so they have to stay in salt water. You won't find them in brackish water. But they're really, really common, especially in like deep water and that. So this is a big group of organisms. So here's an example I found, pictures of some starfish larvae, and you can see the bilateral symmetry here. And if you study echinoderms, the fossil echinoderms had bilateral symmetry in the adults, just like the chordates and just like a lot of the other organisms that we've been studying recently. And so this radial symmetry is a derived characteristic that is, seen in the adults but not in the larvae. And so we're not going to go into many details about these. We're not going to dissect any. They're just interesting organisms. Starfish you're familiar with, and here's several examples of different kinds of starfish and how pretty they can be. Brittle stars are probably the most common echinoderm. And so again, you see the five arms, which is pretty typical, although some have more, some have fewer, but 5 arms is pretty typical in this group. Sea urchins, again, these at first glance don't seem to be in any way closely related to things like chordates, but they are. Sand dollar is another type of sea urchin. You maybe have found these or familiar with these if you've ever been to the beach. So the sea cucumbers, these are also interesting looking organisms. They're also in Echinodermata. And finally, the sea lilies, or crinoids. And you might remember that I mentioned these earlier in the semester when I was talking about evolution and talking about some fossils that I found. And so on the left are some fossils that I found in Bay City, Illinois, southern Illinois. And these were identified as the columns of a crinoid or of a sea lily. So that suggests that at one time the ocean made it all the way up to southern Illinois, and that's what we think. We think the Gulf of Mexico extended all the way up into southern Illinois, and so these echinoderms were growing there and died and fossilized, and I came along a long time later and found them. Okay, so not too much. That's all we're going to cover on echinoderms. Let me know if you got any questions.